Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, good afternoon. We're about to get started. I'm looking at the audience and I'm seeing some faces of people I've been seeing since Friday. So I know some of you all have been here for the full 3 days. And I hope you've been, getting enough sleep, drinking enough caffeine, because I know it's been an absolutely packed festival program. And I think that before we get the session started, you should all give yourselves a big round of applause for being here this afternoon. So, as you know, this is the last event in the old fire station at this year's festival. It's not the last festival event, but it's the last event on this stage. And we very deliberately planned it so that this would be the finale of the festival in the old fire station, because we are here to launch what I think is one of the most important books about Caribbean literary history that I've come across in quite some time. That's not an exaggeration. And of course, you know what it is. It is Equal to Mystery, which is Christopher Laird's biography of Harold Sonny Ladoo. Now, I'm not going to give you the whole who is Harold Sonny Ladoo, because there are people on stage who know that much better than me. But as you know, very important Trinidadian writer, died under mysterious and violent circumstances, very young, a literary career that was cut off after just 2 published books. And there's so many myths and stories about him. And one of the things that Christopher's book does is show us what is the truth behind the myth and how many of the things we think we know about Ladoo are not the case at all. That there was self-mythologizing, there was, incorrectly remembered anecdotes. I think it's hard to imagine that there's any other source of information that exists in the world anymore that you have not managed to track down. And that is testament to a very long obsession, I don't think you'd object to me using that word, an obsession with Ladoo, which dates back more than 40 years. And anybody who knows Christopher Laird knows this, that he's been in different ways, in different forms. Originally, I know it was meant to be a film. In the end, it's a book. And it's a book that gives an important writer back to us, a writer who it's not that we've forgotten him, but because of the circumstances of his death, because of the circumstances of his afterlife, the way his archive was dispersed, all of these reasons, an author who has still almost been in the shadows. And he's now not quite brought out of the shadows, because as the title of the book says, there will always be a lot that is mysterious about Ladoo, but as close into the light as he can be humanly brought. That's what this book does. I found it an absolutely gripping read, and I learned so much about so many things that I didn't know. So, of course, we have the author of the book, Christopher Laird, here with us. I'm going to do very quick bios just so we can get straight into the good part of this, right? So everybody knows Christopher as a filmmaker. Everybody knows about Banyan. We've done a showcase of films from the Banyan archive at the festival. He's now, he was a literary editor. Some people may remember a journal called Kyrie from the 1970s. So it's not that he's a stranger to literature and publishing, but this is his first book. He's a debut author, and that deserves a round of applause. Very reassuring to know that you can be a debut author at any stage in your career. There are many of you in the audience, maybe you don't know it as yet, but you're going to be a writer and publish a book one day too. With us, of course, is Jeremy Pointing of People Tree Press, the publisher of the book, who himself has a long history with Ladoo, which I think some of which will come out in the conversation. Also joining us, Gabrielle Hossain, scholar, activist, writer, poet, performer. And next to her, Kevin Jared Hussein, fiction writer. Of course, he read from his most recent novel, Hungry Ghosts, a couple of days ago at the festival. We felt it was important for this to be a conversation across generations, because Ladoo died more than 40 years ago, but is a writer whose work is still incredibly relevant to us in the present, for all kinds of reasons that will come out in this conversation. And his story, his life story, how he was formed, who he was, what he did, his ambitions, there's something very contemporary to me about the dilemmas he found himself in, the way he tried to construct his life as a person, inventing. As you may hear in this conversation and as the book brings out, he very much had to kind of write himself into being before he could write the books, I think is a fair way to put it. So we're happy to have Kevin and Gabrielle here to bring their very particular perspectives. They are both readers of Ladoo who have a lot to say about him. This is probably like, the most, a concentration of Ladoo knowledge and enthusiasm, inspiration and influence that, it's probably been a long time since something like this has been assembled in one place. So we're very happy and privileged to have it at the festival this year. As usual, I've said too much. Let's get the conversation started. Jeremy will tell you a bit about the book, and we'll go from there. Thank you for coming.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here. I've got perhaps just a little introduction to say some context for it, and the kind of delight to be launching this book, because it represents a number of things. I mean, one of the things it represents is discovering Christopher again. And we're remembering that about 47 years ago, we met in Trinidad, I think it was probably in Anson Gonzalez's house, and discovering that what Christopher was doing at that point. So it's an absolute delight to meet him again in person 47 years later. It's also a kind of, I remember too, just one of the things that Christopher did, that Nicholas has mentioned, he produced this really innovative journal. I mean, it lasted for a couple of years, didn't it? Carrie lasted a couple of years. And it was innovative in its form. It often was loose leaf. It was in a packet. It contained things like 45 Revolution records, I think Mark Matthews and things like that. So it was a very, very important kind of intervention and very contemporary in the kind of writing that it was presented. And one of the things, I mean, when Christopher sent them, inquired whether we'd be interested, I was immediately kind of interested because I'd read Ladoo back in, I still have the original, those books that came out in the 70s. And I still had Kyrie, so I looked up, pulled the things out, and there is Victor Cattle's review of No Pain Like This Body, which is in the book, in the appendix of the book. There is Christopher's own review of Yesterday's, which is also in the book. And when I looked at it, I found that my copy of Christopher's review of Yesterday's has lots of pencil marginalia on it. And in some cases disagreeing totally with Christopher's view of the novel. And that kind of disagreement's really healthy, really. It's also then, as Nicholas has suggested, a real accumulation, an ending of a kind of odyssey, which has been kind of going for a long time. So there is a triumph there. When an odyssey kind of comes to a conclusion, it's worth acknowledging the kind of effort that's gone into it, the persistence that's gone into it, the kind of when you read the book, as I hope you will read it, you will see just how much ground had to be covered. The journeyings to Toronto, the kind of interviews done with all sorts of different people, the attempt to discover a truth. And I mean, one of the things Nicholas mentioned that it was meant to be a film. The film is in process of production. So there is a triumphant ending to this story that began probably 20 or 30 or 40 years ago to bring Harold Sonny Ladoo back into focus. I'm going to start off by inviting Christopher to read from the book in a way of perhaps of answering a couple of questions. One very obvious question, which he addresses in the book, is what was it about those Ladoo novels when they arrived on his desk as a reviewer for Kyrie and as the editor of Kyrie? What was it that so fascinated him, that set him off on this long kind of journey to find out about Ladoo? And he's written about that in the preface, and he will read from a bit about that. I think that perhaps the other thing that perhaps we'll invite Christopher to say right at the beginning is, Nicholas mentioned that there was a lot of myth-making about who Ladoo was, of which Ladoo was himself mostly responsible. About, the biography that Ladoo presented to the world was about 100% untrue. And I think that, for instance, when I read some of those novels then, I might have read them slightly differently if I had known more about what, who Ladoo actually was. So that I think, there's a question we'll perhaps all address, that, does a biography change the way we think about somebody like Ladoo and the way we might read Ladoo now? Anyway, so I'm going to invite Christopher to tell us a bit more, by reading from the book, about where this all began. What was it about Ladoo that so fascinated him that it set him off to trying to pin, this man was never going to be pinned down, but to get as near as possible to the truth about him. So, Christopher.
Hello and welcome to everyone. Thanks very much for turning up. Yes, I told Jeremy that I would read a bit from the introduction because it answers a lot of the questions that people always ask, which are kind of obvious. Why Ladoo? Why are you focusing on this? People always ask me, why this dark, violent vision? Why are you going into that? Why are you spending time on that? Well, I don't know, but I think it speaks to something deep inside of us that is not normally articulated. Anyway, I don't want to waste time. I'm going to read bits from the introduction. I can't read the whole thing, it'll take too long. Which will give you an answer to some of these questions and give you an idea of how I approached it. Now, I'm reading from the introduction because it's better that it's more concise than me trying to ad-lib. Okay, so this is from the introduction. It starts with a quote. "Only by dying brutally can man become equal to mystery." This is written by Harold Sonny Ladoo in a short story called A Short Story. So naturally, when I saw that quote, that's the title. Anyway, I never met Harold Ladoo. I discovered his writing almost by accident. It was in 1974 in Port of Spain, and I was working on a soon-to-be launched periodical called Kyrie. One morning, a book landed on my desk for review, and to this day, I have no idea how it got there or who sent it. But from the first staccato paragraph, I was hooked. Quote, "Pa came home. He didn't talk to Ma. He came home just like a snake, quiet." What followed was so spare, so violent, so human, that I can still feel the shock waves it produced. The book was No Pain Like This Body, Harold Sonny Ladoo's first novel. It exploded in our midst and set me on a quest that has lasted for nearly 50 years. Who was this man glowering from the back cover of the book with such coiled intensity? The biographical note gave only the skimpiest clues. It said Ladoo was born in Trinidad in 1945 and emigrated to Canada in 1968. Given his surname and the author, given his surname and the author's photo, he was clearly of Indian descent, like half the people in Trinidad. There in 1974, when his second novel, Yesterday, appeared, there was a new biographical detail on the back cover. Ladoo had been killed in Trinidad in 1973. He was 28. Now, you have to remember that every single fragment of Harold's writing that survives at all was written in 3 years, between 1970 and 1973. And during that time, and around that time, as you can imagine, what was happening in Trinidad at the same time? The 1970 revolution, that we called it, a cultural and political and sociological shift for the whole population. And part of this seismic shift took place in the cultural field. there was a grassroots movement to revitalize traditional forms in music, dance, and theater to express the experience of the young nation by reimagining in contemporary terms forms previously considered too parochial and unsophisticated to be taken seriously. Our aim at Kyrie was to analyze and celebrate this turn towards our roots in Trinidad and across the Caribbean, and we covered all aspects of culture: music, writing, theater, carnival arts, photography, and the visual arts. Ladoo's novels were a gift to our purpose. We rejoice in their fierce originality. Add the drama of his death and the glowering cover photograph, and we were in awe. We ran lengthy reviews of both Ladoo's novels in Kyrie. They remain, with all their youthful naivety and faux pas, the most comprehensive appreciation of his writing published in the West Indies at that time. Sections of the Caribbean literary establishment took little notice of Harold Ladoo, or if they acknowledged him at all, it was as an oddity, a dead-end rebel, a one-hit wonder. It seemed incomprehensible to me that quite apart from Ladoo's literary accomplishments, no one was asking how come, as Ladoo might have put it, quote, a little coolie boy from Trinidad within 3 years, earned a university degree in Canada, in the University of Toronto, published 2 landmark novels, was later the subject of a long poem by Toronto's first poet laureate, had a prize for creative writing established in his name at the University of Toronto, and an art project dedicated to him by a major Canadian artist who had never met him. What would a biography of Ladoo reveal about this unlikely trajectory? We who grew up in the optimism of federation and independence were traitors if we criticized Trinidad. We had to deny the negative and promote the positive. Ladoo was a child of independence too, but he sensed its dark side. He experienced it viscerally and fled Trinidad knowing it would always be there. More specifically, independence had not embraced the Trinidadian Indian community. In the latter 1960s and early 70s, many politicized young Indo-Trinidadians saw themselves as an oppressed minority. As of Trinidad and Tobago independence, however, in August 31st, 1962, the horrific chapters of our history were papered over, sealed off. Optimism and sunshine were now the order of the day. What place did recollecting such massive crimes as genocide, slavery, and indentureship have in the new Trinidad? But Ladoo was having none of this willed amnesia. His calling was to strip away the facade, to tell ugly counter-truths on an epic scale, to mash up the colonial furniture. So I was drawn to his work, not in spite of its dark and violent vision, but because of it. Someone was finally getting down to business in our literature, making the fierce reckoning we needed. Ladoo had a kind of pure rage on tap, a connection to the, sorry, my eyes, the connection to the elemental, to a raw power he rode, which he would release and wrestle into art. What did this mean for us and our literature? That I didn't know, but as a reader and as a biographer, I was going to ride it with him. So the last piece I will read is a little piece from the chapter where he arrives in Toronto. And this will show you a little bit of how the book is structured using Harold's own writing to tell his story. So here's a little piece of that. Toronto, the magnificent captivity. So far, I have refrained from conjectures about what Harold would have thought about this or what he may have felt about that. But it isn't hard to imagine his first response to seeing Toronto in August 1968 as their plane crossed Lake Ontario and began the descent to what was then Toronto International Airport. He and Rachel would have devoured their first glimpse of the city. It was a daunting yet exhilarating prospect. In Harold's fictional account of the descent, his alter ego, Sawak, declares, quote, at 16,000 feet, Toronto and the suburbs blossomed. What could be more pleasant than to look down on the city I had dreamed? But as Harold and Rachel descended further, the vista would have become less idyllic. There were so many buildings, strangely similar, laid out in right-angle grids that stretched for miles until they reached the skyscrapers downtown. People like ants, all jammed together, piled on top of each other, so unlike the village they had left that morning. How could anyone live this way? They were about to find out. Harold's eldest sister, Sylvia, and her husband, Manoram Sukram, had moved to Canada some years before. Sylvia worked in a bank and Manoram was an engineer. They were sponsoring Harold and Rachel as landed immigrants. The couples met at the airport and taxied together into downtown Toronto, passing sights that, till then, Harold had seen only in movies. Cars driving on the wrong side of the road, throngs of white people hustling and bustling along the sidewalks. Toronto at ground level was nowhere near as inviting as it was at 16,000 feet. At least not in 15 Belshore Place, the dilapidated high-rise where Harold and Rachel would live during their first year in the city. They were crammed into an apartment with Sylvia, Manoram, and their 4 children. In 1948, construction had on the Regent Park, where Belshore Place was situated, began. But in the late 1960s, when Harold and Rachel arrived, it had become one of the most notorious slums in the country, reproducing the very problems it was meant to solve. To quote, by the mid-1960s, for example, there was a complaint about the housing projects falling into states of disrepair. Immigrants from the Caribbean, China, and Southeast Asia settled in Regent's Park in the 60s and 70s, changing the ethnic and racial composition of the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the area continued to have a reputation for crime. Without realizing it, Harold and Rachel had signed on for a crash course in down and out Toronto. There is no first-hand account of Harold and Rachel's time in this part of Toronto, but there is in the first Canadian novel, the 15-page fragment from 1973, unpublished till now, where Harold recast and probably heightened his own experience as a new immigrant through the character of his protagonist and alter ego, Sawak. Unlike Harold, Sawak travels to Toronto alone and stays with a friend from the island, Sally Khan, who lives in a squalid rooming house with his wife. In this excerpt, Sawak awakens on the first morning in Toronto to face a series of culture shocks. Here, Sally Khan is preparing eggs and slicing bread. Quote, putting the fried eggs on 2 old plates, he went to the rug on which Sawak was sitting. Eat this bread and this egg. We had our toaster, but it's not working. Sawak was surprised. He had expected a heavy meal, rice, and roti. As he ate the egg, he missed home, especially his wife, Indra. She had always fed him good. The egg tasted lousy. Khan said, you have to get accustomed to this kind of food. Only people who have money could eat good in Toronto. but you have some ketchup or something to put on the egg? What I go tell you, boy, Sawak, it hardly has anything to eat in this house. My wife working in that factory for just a little thing. She on that factory job 2 months now. But the other day, somebody report she to immigration. People is son of a bitches. Boy, Sawak, just imagine, after 10 years, my wife have to hide from immigration. I can't work in peace, no place. I always have to afraid. You will get ahead, Sawak said. You must have to live with a plan, like Vishnu of Tola had a plan. You see how well things moving on him? That is a different man. Vishnu of Tola come here as landed immigrant. He had a good brain, he's a professor. But if he had to hide from immigration, you think he could make anything? Perhaps not, Sawak admitted. After they were finished, Khan carried the plates and put them in his sink. Walking back to the rug with 2 pieces of board, he said, "Help me kill some cockroach, na boy." They began by removing the rug. The floor had the odor of rotting vegetables. A few cockroaches were swatted with the first boards, with the flat boards. While they were still hunting down the cockroaches, the Italian landlord came up the steps. Without knocking or even calling, he walked right into the hall. A red glow on his face made him look formidable. He said, "Me want no noise, all right? I speak before about noise. You speak, no speaker again. You have some people staying then, you pay $25 more. Pay tomorrow or get out." Khan tried to explain about the cockroaches in the house, but the landlord said, "This is my house. You no like, then go. You pay $105 or go. Me no speak again." This was not a terrible scene for Khan. In his magnificent captivity, he had met with more arrogance. Long ago, he had learned to exercise considerable patience in such situations. End of quote. Harold's writing is replete with such cinematic images, comic, bizarre, but also serious and existential. 2 men, each holding a piece of board, squatting on the floor with the rug rolled back and swatting cockroaches, accompanied by loud bangs, with an Italian man standing over them, berating and threatening them. Their lives caught between the landlord and the cockroaches. Lose-lose either way. So that's my piece. Thank you.
Okay, before I start asking some questions, perhaps just worth saying 1 or 2 words about what else is in the book. I mean, there is Christopher's kind of narrative of the pursuit of who was the real Harold Sonny Ladoo. But it's also a book which has been made by somebody who's been in media for a long time. So it's a book which has got plenty of photographs in it. So you know exactly what the houses were that Harold lived in. You know what the views of Toronto were. There are pictures of the village that Harold came from, so that it has that richness. It's also, perhaps most importantly, contains a very, very generous sample of the unpublished work that Ladoo wrote while he was in Canada. So, you know, only the 2 novels and I think a couple of stories were ever actually published officially. But this book has it has an appendix of kind of critical stuff, but it also quotes extensively, and in some cases offers you whole short stories that Ladoo wrote. So that, you know, there is the opportunity in the book. Sometimes you have to think it's a what might have been. There are a handful of really, really good stories, and you know, at the minute we're wondering whether there is a short story collection to be brought out of it. Some of the stuff there is fragmentary, but nevertheless very, very interesting, and sort of shows, you know, it shows the tragedy of Ladoo's life being cut short in that way, because you see possibilities where, you know, other directions that he might have gone in. let's bring some other people into this. I'm probably surprised me. If you don't want to answer it, then you can say, this is a question really for Gabrielle and Kevin. You say authors of biographies can choose whether they stay out of the picture. They can be behind the scenes. We don't know why it is that they're doing that. Christopher puts himself right in the picture. We know from his other things why he's doing that. What do you think may be gained from that, having the author there as part of the story, as a biography?
This one, right? I suppose the thing that immediately comes to mind is that writers that I've read that have lived a long time ago, and I don't know much about them, not on Twitter or anything, tweeting all the time. There's a mystique that they have, because typically I don't like to read too much of their lives, because you encounter some gross things sometimes. The difference here with Sonny Ladoo is that his writing is very much characterized by dark and violent and grotesquerie. So, and there's as I said, there's the added drama of his death on top of this, and the what could have been, what might have been. I think that he's an important figure to explore in this case. So when I was looking through the book, and I saw two things in particular that stood out for me. That there was, I said, a lot of what he may have written about in service fiction, but he did have the ambition, as he put it, to write 200 novels. And as far as I know, he has 2. And I haven't read any of his short stories, but what also stood out for me is that there's a character in No Pain Like This Body named Benoit, who's a stick fighter. And there's a fragment of a short story in there where Benoit is a character in there. And he's sort of a male hero character, but he's really just a very, very minor character in No Pain Like This Body. And there's something that immediately came to my mind. And when I was a teenager, I fed myself a diet of Stephen King and Cormac McCarthy, but Stephen King, if we're familiar with his work, he sets all of his stories, most of his stories in Castle Rock, and mostly there's a history behind Castle Rock, and there's a characters interplay. There's a sheriff that shows up in multiple stories, and I was wondering that if Ladoo had a plan like that, if he had like a character map or even a roster of people that he might have used in, well, I don't know if he would have accomplished 200, that's his ambition, but if he would have lived longer. So I think it's important, yes, to delve into his backstory, his life, to see at least the ambition of that time, a writer in that time in the 1970s.
Gabrielle, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thanks so much. Afternoon, everyone. So, while this is a look at Harold Sonny Ladoo's history, both his writing and his life, this is also a book about Christopher Laird's obsession with Harold Sonny Ladoo. And so this is really also a book about you. Christopher comes in first with that introduction about Kairi and the turn towards valuing the arts that also values the roots of the society. And it was interesting that you opened with that, because one wonders what sustained this over so much data collection, interviews, archival material, and so on. And so for me, I really valued that this was a book that was documenting Christopher's own journeys. He talks about Ramabai Espinay carrying you around Toronto to see sights. He speaks about the experience of Harold Sonny Ladoo's family, his wife, his son, the relationships that you developed. And also at the end, and I hope I have some questions for you, and I hope you'll talk about them more. He talks about the experience of learning to write as a writer, not as a script writer and not as the filmmaker that we know him for all these decades to be. And I found that I really love that you went through what it took, in a sense, and the support that you provided, the support that was provided by editors to produce this book. And so I think it is very important that Christopher weaves himself into this story, particularly because it is a book about backstories.
Absolutely.
And so something would have been lost without that.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that thing, I mean, one of the things I found fascinating about the book was the relationship between Harold Ladoo and the Canadians who were supporting him, Dennis Lee and Peter Such. And there is a story of it's an ambiguous story sometimes, isn't it? In the sense that they probably never quite work out who he is, because he tells them different things about himself. There is a sense to which you see that Ladoo is playing a kind of tricksterish kind of role, isn't he? I mean, to some extent, these two people who supported him immensely in Canada, who, I mean, Christopher will say, helped him immensely with the book, were very generous in terms of sharing what their relationship. But I thought that was one of the very interesting things about a relationship that's across cultures, across a kind, sort of an absence of shared kind of experience. There is they're having to work out who is this man who has this talent, who is telling us these things about himself. And you see elements of manipulation in the relationship with him. We'd like to comment on that.
Let me try and cover all what you said. The editor at work. All right. You mentioned about shared characters and stories. Are you hearing me, right? Yeah. As you know, I make a lot about the fact that Harold built his novels out of stories. And so he was writing stories and hoping to put them all together in a novel. But I also deal with the question of shared characters, because there's about 3 different areas of shared characters. One coming out of the No Pain Like This Body cast of characters, like Benoit. Benoit not only appears in another story, but he also appears in not just one story, but at least 2 stories, one of which his son is also featured. He's living in Toronto. Benoit hears that he's dead. He wants to send someone to get him to the funeral. And who does he send? He sends the son of Ma and Pa in No Pain Like This Body, because Sonny the daughter, is also in Toronto. So he mixes these characters, another set of characters that relate to his family, and there's another, there's 3 sets which I figure he could have used to make more novels if he had the length of time. So yes, he does use the shared characters, which is something Selvon does too, of course. So Selvon, Lonely in London, is a largely short stories, but it's like a novel, so it's all shared characters to some extent. In terms of the question about my learning to write, I think I will just read a little bit from the acknowledgements, because I don't trust myself to ad-lib with the time we have. So let me just read a little piece about that in the acknowledgements. All right. I am not a writer. I am a filmmaker. In writing this book, I had to learn a lot about writing and about biographies. Writing a biography to be published as a text demands much more research, detail, and precision than writing a biography for a film. It also requires want to be literate enough to keep the reader engaged. The first drafts of this book were transliterated directly from the scripts of the 6-part documentary series that I had started work on. And converting it into a book took a lot of guidance from editors, as Gabby says. In the first 5 years, it took me to write it. I came to understand what a writer is and know that while I may not be a professional writer, I had to develop enough of the necessary skills to make at least this one book publishable. In this, I was aided and spurred on by the strength of the story, but it was the generous mentorship of the poet and editor, Dennis Lee, who, despite initial protests that he didn't have the time, stuck by me as de facto editor by email for 5 years it took before we considered it a good enough shape to be submitted to a publisher. He worked closely with me, particularly in the first 12 chapters. Dennis's incredible empathy and incisive engagement kept me on my toes, ingrained in me over the years a new discipline, and made the process a privileged masterclass and one of the most memorable periods of my life. I cannot overstate what it meant for me or the book, not to mention his permitting me to quote extensively from his poem, The Death of Harold Ladoo. As I said, I cannot overestimate the impact of his work with me, and then later with Jeremy, that taught me a lot about writing. I mean, one of the first things that Dennis told me when we started with me is, okay, get as many biographies as you can and read them. And then you'll find out, say what you like, what you don't like, what you're trying to do, what you're not trying to do. So that was, as you said, it was a masterclass. I'm not saying I'm now a writer, but I have a little more confidence. And I find also, to my dismay, that a lot of shit writing, that I tend to read, I'm finding it hard to read. So that's to answer your question. Your question you had, which was?
A question about what the book says about the relationship between those Canadians who supported Ladoo.
No.
Across cultures.
Well, one of the first things that came obvious to me once I did the interviews with all the informants, and this was back when I was trying to do the documentary, was that everyone's described Harold a different way. They were none the same, and there was a big difference between the Canadians, his family, and Trinidadians in general. And they all had 3 different ways of looking at Harold. And when you look at it and compare all the stories, and you see how much he was making up, especially for the Canadians, my take on it was, here's a young man from McBean in central Trinidad, a little village at that time, and everyone knew him. They know his stories, they know his family, they know his home truths. He can't get away with anything. Goes to Canada, big city, meets these white people who know nothing about that. I can invent. I can story tell. And he story told. And so he invented various characters for himself. One of the examples given in the book is that two of the Canadians mentioned he had a scar on his neck. And he had told them different stories. One of the most fantastic was he had got it in a knife fight on a ship from Valparaiso. You'll believe anything. And I think that he was just playing on their idea of this exotic character from a society they knew nothing about. And he played on that. And he also had the ability he had great empathy, and he could, when talking to people, I think he assessed what he could tell them that they would like. And so Peter Such, who was his mentor, who brought him into the university and was his steady friend for the whole time he was there. And Peter Such grew up in an orphanage. He experienced violence in the orphanage and abuse. Harold told him that he grew up in an orphanage, that he experienced violence in the Canadian missionary school, and so on. So they bonded. And Peter thought that, wow, here's a like soul. And that's the sort of stuff he would do.
Yeah. Would you like to comment, Kevin, and would you like to comment on that?
Writers are cunning people. Yeah, you have to be cunning to get through sometimes. What I was thinking about was, there's descriptions of him in the book where he is, up and down Chaguanas, by Jubilee Cinema and so on, and he always has a book with him. And it's usually stuffed in his back pocket. And he said that if it's a book that's stuffed in your pocket, it could be like a dime store comic book or one of those old westerns. Right. And that is possibly the kind of books that he had access to, especially in Chaguanas, which I think was described as a one-room library that probably, And I was thinking that at the time, so that was what his reading experience, his early reading experience would have been. And there's a chapter in here that's called Just Write What You Know, where he writes, I believe it's a novel or a novella, and he sends it to Peter Such or Dennis Lee, the publishers. I believe it's House of Anansi, and they sent it back and said, you're writing too much about the official Trinidad. You're not really writing what, you need to get more into the unofficial parts of it. These are things we've seen. And, Harold becomes very angry. And he writes the short story, which would then become No Pain Like This Body. And at the time in the 1970s, I was wondering if there's a type of stubbornness that went into this type of language to defy the genres, like almost an invented marketing ploy, but that there was something to defy what we would know as urban literature in the 1970s, where we had all this rebellion, that he would evoke some of that. Because when I read No Pain Like This Body, I didn't know much about it. I read it blind. And I said, this reads like a horror novel. The characters are not really described, they're presented, and one of his editors described the work as such, and that's one of those aspects of horror writing. You present this in different ways. And I was wondering if there's a kind of stubbornness that he wanted to rebel against what contemporary, at the time, urban literature would have been, and would have gone in a totally different, the darkest, most grotesque direction he could have gone, as a sort of impish, shocking kind of way.
I'm not sure. I mean, this is all conjecture. Yes, that image of the book crammed into their back pocket, when one of my informants gave me that image, it immediately exploded in my head. And we all know that image. If you don't have a book crammed in your back pocket, what do you have? Your pants sticks and various things like that. So immediately that image just comes. And I said, wow, that will tell me what he read, what he was reading. And so I think comics, he liked westerns. He liked the cinema he liked was westerns and superhero type things. Steve Reeves was one of the people he liked to watch. So yeah, that image is just, as key to what to giving a clue, and those are the sort of clues one has to look for in this sort of exercise, where there is nobody to tell you anything. I would ask his sister, I would ask his wife what he read. They don't know. They never. His wife didn't even read his writing, so nobody knew. But just the idea of this young boy walking down the street with a book crammed in his back pocket, and at the same time, that same person said he was like an evangelist for reading. He would just encourage people around him to read. You must read, you must read, you must read. And he would give them books or suggest books for them to read. That all comes out of that image.
A good question for Gabrielle, really. Do you think there's something that is, I was going to say peculiarly, is something particularly male about that kind of invention of character, of self-invention?
Thanks, and so much, yeah. And I actually wanted to follow up with a question to Chris as well. Well, the fact of Ladoo's life as a man, and what pressures that put him under, in terms of the pressures he felt, for example, walking in his father's shadow, and then the pressures that he felt wanting to be a writer and being able to escape responsibility for childcare. Chris details a really poignant part of the interview with his wife Rachel, where she would be going off to work 2 double shifts and would come home and would find the baby in the crib, hungry, without food, in the dark, and so on. And so it's clear that he was negotiating many, many things that are both the pain and the power and the privilege, and then the aspirations associated with manhood and masculinity. And then also, you also detail the extent to which he would be moving around the grimy parts of the city, whether for his own escape or for material or for his own self-definition. And I think that too is absolutely crucial. And I do want to follow up with a question for Chris, but also to say that Israel Khan is in the audience, and he was actually a friend of Sonny Ladoo. And so it's interesting that we're speaking about somebody who has been gone for so long, but is also alive in the memories of so many others. So he's taking on his own mythology in this text in a really interesting way. We're making conjectures about him, as one does when people are gone. But he's actually had real relationships that could be very problematic or could be very humorous and so on.
I'd like, Gabi has brought up a number of essential points in the book. One, yes, his treatment of women in life is different from his treatment of women in his writing, which I thought was an interesting situation, because his wife would complain how he used to hit her, he insulted her, told her that all she was good for, all he brought her to Canada for, was to cook and keep house while he did his business, and so on. But in his writing, he has written stories, like there's a story called The Teacher's Wife, where a wife is experiencing exactly that, what his wife experiences, but the man in the story is being berated by another man, how he could treat his wife like that, and so on and so on. In other words, as a writer, he felt he had truth to tell, even if it was against his own actions. So I think that sort of stands out a little bit about how he saw writing as a responsibility, quite different from living as a responsibility. The other thing is that, there's another part of your story, of your question. The thing about the fact that Israel is here, for example, Mr. Khan, there are all the people who knew him 50 years ago, they still remember him. He has a special part in their lives. The artist, Jasmine Hassan, who lives in London, Canada, who came to Trinidad on a art connection workshop, she devoted a whole project to him, went down to McBean, meet his sister and so on. She never knew him. But what she said was, she's another one who came up with an image that just resonates. She and her brother worked in a restaurant as, waiters and waitresses and so on. And when No Pain came out, she said all the staff would read it. It went from hand to hand, according to her. It went from hand to hand with the kitchen staff. Why? Because he was also a kitchen worker, a restaurant worker. And they thought they were all aspiring artists. As aspiring artists, workers, waiters, and so on. And they thought, here's someone who made it, maybe we can too. And the book passed from hand to hand among the waiters, the restaurant staff of the restaurant that she was working with. So, back to the empathy, in that people remember Harold with a special feeling. That he had a special impact on people. People remember him in a way that they wouldn't remember anyone else. And that's also something I wanted to look more into. Why? How? What was it about him? It's the same way that I said we were hooked when we read the first thing. You're hooked, and you stay hooked because it's so fascinating.
Well, that's a very good answer to that. I think perhaps what we should do, we want to open this out in a little bit, but the point of Christopher's book is, I think, to make us read Ladoo again, and to read Ladoo with new eyes. So perhaps what we could turn to do is talking a bit more about the books, Harold's books. Perhaps to say when did you perhaps as a question to Christopher, when you were writing the book, you'd read the books and you were excited by them nearly 50 years ago. When you encountered them again, when you were in did you have the same kind of response? And then I'm going to ask Gabrielle and Kevin, when did you first encounter Ladoo? And
well, it is difficult, having once got a certain response from that book, to read it again, not get a similar response. I didn't change. My response didn't change. But that might just be me. I like to hang on to things for a long time.
I think I first read No Pain Like This Body when I was 19 as a student at University of Toronto. Arnold Ditwaru, who you mentioned here, was actually one of my lecturers. And he was inviting us to go on this whole decolonial path. So, you start reading Brathwaite and Laming and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and you start, returning to how to think about the Caribbean. And of course, you don't read Ladoo without being extremely traumatized. Just like when you read Kevin's novels, you have to drink some puncheon after to settle your soul when you're done. But I wanted to return to the question of his writings for a second, Jeremy, which is to say that I wonder for the audience if you could talk about, there are so many gaps in trying to explain Ladoo's history that you turn to his writing as if his writing is biographical. You referred just now to his character Sawak as an alter ego. Again, that's some creative license. But I think what's interesting and worth talking about is how much you wrote this biography by reading his writing in conversation with what you knew about his life, which isn't typical for biographies, because you can write biographies of politicians or others. So the filling in the gaps of the stories with his writing was so important that many times you say, this story has only been published here. This story has never been published, this excerpt has never been published anywhere else. And so you're doing something for those who pick up this book to turn to that conversation between his life and his writing. And just to ask Kevin, because you seem to me to be a literary descendant of Ladoo, in the sense that when you've read his novel, so much about your own novel seems to be a descendant of someone writing so many decades before you have come to write. And in a way, Ladoo was mining his life for his fiction, and mining fiction, and you've mined his fiction for his life. And I'm thinking, Kevin, about how much you've talked about mining your own life, not you personally, but your grandfather, the stories around you, in order to write your fiction as well, and maybe to talk a little bit about what happens in the conversation between those two.
There's something said of Naipaul and a House of Mr. Biswas in this book, and about the setting that Sonny Ladoo writes, and especially No Pain Like, but all throughout his work, and that is that he went into these settings, whereas like in House of Mr. Biswas, they were seen at a distance. And he said usually when you were writing about this highly impoverished people or the downtrodden, it was usually from a point of view of ridicule or scorn. Now you could immediately you can go in the totally opposite direction. You could go a total slumdog millionaire with it and exoticize it and make it seem like it can be a buppy life, right? And he found, as dark as it is still a middle ground with the characters, this rust of characters that he had, because they weren't just down and out. They did have ambition throughout, and it does take some form of self-reflection and level of observation to see that. And I think it's because he was, as you say, he was in it, and he wasn't writing it from a distance. And I think like if I was to comment on my own writing with it, I think like partly, but I grew up around story. I didn't grow up in that time, but I grew up around stories like that. It was passed down to me. People who would have lived like that, I would have seen like remnants of it. And there's also a sort of lateral discrimination, not just like from a higher to a lower level, but lateral discrimination would have occurred as well. And, I would have partaken in it, and people would have inflicted it upon me. And experiencing that is a totally different thing. And I think him being the chameleonic character that he is, he can easily, and I don't mean to use this animal term, but he can easily slither in and out of different personalities when it comes to drawing in or mining these characteristics from his own family, from his people around him, even from the Canadians. So I would think that, as I said, writers are cunning people. And he was able to venture out in that field and get that information.
The thing, there was something you talked about earlier about description. I just make a point. One of the points I make, I don't know if I'm good ground here. Literary people will tell me, but for example, when I read your work, I had heard that from a quote from you, I think, that Harold or No Pain was a big influence on you in early days. When you compare it, you see very clearly that Harold does not do the descriptions that you just mentioned. He doesn't describe. He just does action. Mm-hmm. So people are described by how they act rather than how they look, most of the time, anyway. And that's a big difference. And so that I just thought I'd mention that because it's something that reoccurs in the book over and over.
I wanted you
yes, you wanted to say something.
I wanted you to talk about how you turned to his fiction in order to fill the gaps in the biography.
Now, obviously, I have a biography to write. There's no diaries. there are no there are only two biographical texts that I could get before I started. That is, Peter Such wrote an incredible memorial essay about a year after Harold died. It was published in BIM and a few other places. Lovely biographical essay about Harold, a lot of feeling, full of Harold's myths. And then Dennis Lee, who wrote this huge, long poem. It was a book, actually, the whole poem in a book about the death of Harold Ladoo. Two of them were the only biographical texts that I had access to. So what was I to do? Well, doing the research, coming across all the stories, coming across all the fragments of writing, you start to see how he is covering areas of his life. He covers how he left McBean, or at least how his character left McBean, and how his character arrived in Toronto, and what they did, and so on. I have to assume, we can't assume that it's word for word exactly what happened to him, but obviously it would have been informed by his own experience. And that is what I used all these fragments as biographical stepping stones, really, to get through his life. It's very convenient. If he hadn't written those stories about those times, I would have been stuck. The early part of his life would have been sort of blank pages or something. But that is why I use the friction. I knew I was stepping on dangerous ground. Dennis Lee, for example, is always very strong on, don't conjecture, don't suppose, just write what happened, So I knew writing this fiction, quoting the fiction is a bit of a dangerous thing. But on the other hand, I didn't really realize I was writing a biography until Dennis Lee told me, having seen the work I wrote, he told me, this is going to be a definitive biography of Harold Ladoo. I said, oh shit. What a responsibility. So then I really have to do research. Because up to then, I was writing a story. I was writing Harold's story. Now, Harold has two things going for him. His writing, which is extraordinary, and his life. His life story, nobody writing a book could escape the intensity of a story. Here it is. It's been written about hundreds of times. Young boy from a rural thing goes to a big city, writes novels, becomes famous, then gets killed before he could even go any further. What a story. Let's work with that. That's a very powerful story. So you have the story and you have his writing. You put the two together, and that's what I had to do, because I wanted people to appreciate his writing also. Because one of the points of the book is that he was neglected by the sort of establishment, the Caribbean literary establishment. One lecturer told me, well, he only has that one book, the other book isn't so good, and so that's why he's not ready. He's a footnote on Caribbean literature. I wanted to take him out of the footnotes. I wanted to bring him and put him in his proper place, because a whole new generation of writers, Kevin and others, have cited him as a major influence in encouraging them to write, and write a particular way. You can't avoid that. You can't just say, oh, well, that's okay, as young people. No. So it's important both to deal with his writing and deal with his life. And those are the way, using his fiction as his biography is a way of putting them together.
I think it's worth saying that it's always very clear in the book is what is a testable kind of documentation of Ladoo's life, and the points in the thing where there is no documentation, and the reader is left to kind of make the judgments about whether the fiction actually does that. So I think I would have objected as an editor if you've been using the fiction to tell a story and speculate whether this was Ladoo's story. And I think it's very clear, I think anybody reading it will find it very clear that there is a sharp distinction between, for instance, the interviews with people and the ways in that this is what Ladoo wrote, and then you're left to make up your kind of minds about how this works. And I don't think there's any other way of doing it, given those gaps in the story. What I'd like to, I mean, you mentioned Dennis Lee, and Dennis Lee kind of ends up, and Dennis Lee has his poem, it's a brilliant poem. As Christopher says, there are generous extracts from it in the book. It's a brilliant poem, a poem of sort of puzzlement, of enthusiasm and infuriation with Ladoo, and the tricks that kind of says. Dennis Lee sort of comes up, makes his summary that Ladoo wrote two novels, one very nearly a very, very good novel, and implies that one isn't. And what we haven't talked at all about Yesterdays, and of course, you know that No Pain Like This Body has recently come out in a Penguin Modern Classic. It's recognised now. Yesterdays has never been reprinted since its earlier days. I mean, I've been wondering about whether we should reprint it or not reprint it, because I'm interested in Christopher and I probably don't agree about Yesterdays as a novel. My kind of reading of Yesterdays was, although it at one kind of level, I mean, it's the same McBean, it's in the 1940s, it's later. There isn't the desperation of poverty that you find in No Pain. And yet I found Yesterdays a much more pessimistic novel. There's when you read No Pain, it's an utterly honest novel about, and it doesn't glamorize, it doesn't, but there is a root of persistence in people. There is a root of kind of the ways in which are people actually fighting against their situation, whereas in Yesterdays there isn't. I didn't find that there. And I was rereading Yesterdays. I found the sexual politics quite troubling in terms of its kind of connections between, I mean, for instance, between homosexuality and the privy. It's a novel which is full of kind of a very pessimistic view. I'd be interested in anybody else's response.
I guess the only thing I could comment on the difference between the two, in terms of the tone, and speaking from the biography here. So when I read No Pain Like This Body, and I was thinking the villain is partially villain is the rain, the weather, the very adversarial environment, scorpions and so on. Things that you really cannot stop. You cannot do anything. It just is, and that's why it comes off as honest. There's really no exaggerating it. The rain, it just is. Well, we know that. Those who in Port of Spain, know that, right? It just is. But I said majority of his work is written in the 1970s, and there's a few years after independence, and there's a patriotic push towards positivity. You have to say good things about the country. We're an independent country now, and as I said, it seems like he was a stubborn person. As he described, he's a chameleonic person. He's also a very stubborn person, and as I said, he could swing one way and be utterly patriotic. He could swing the whole other way and be pessimistic. So you would highlight all the ugliness, what you see as the evils of the country, especially for someone who doesn't, want to stay in Trinidad, or who has this schizophrenic relationship with himself. So I guess that's what again, it's conjecture, but that's what I can comment about it.
Gabriel, you want to? Sorry.
Yesterdays. Well, Yesterdays, I agree. All right. For example, I'll read that last line that you talk about in Dennis' poem. He says, "Your final legacy, 2 minor early novels one being nearly first rate. That's Dennis. He ain't giving you nothing. So yesterday's, I think, is write what you know, gone crazy. It's a bit like, if you compare No Pain and yesterday's, it's like if Quentin Tarantino did a Mel Brooks movie. It's that crazy. It's totally bizarre. It's you could say obscene, but it's about homosexuality. It's about shit. It's about all sorts of things like that. It's very funny, but for Trinidadians, not necessarily for non-Trinidadians. 10 minutes. So I think it was a problem with yesterday's. He was just writing, he was just riffing for the whole novel. And so we get a lot of fun out of it. But anybody who can't understand or can't read Trinidadian and get into this old, I think I put the beginning of that chapter on yesterday's, I quote the old thing, should talk back in tongue, should talk back in tongue. That's how he approached yesterday's. So I have no literary claims for yesterday's, except that it's very funny.
Okay, all right. I mean, again, I mean, we could talk. I mean, one of my feelings about yesterday's was that Ladoo was let down by his editor there. Ladoo bamboozled his editor in thinking that he'd finished with it. Whereas I think one has to acknowledge that in terms of No Pay, Dennis Lee had played an important role in sharpening that novel and kind of encouraging Ladoo into his best kind of skills. Yeah.
So I think one of the important things for this discussion is how much we now have access to the letters between Ladoo and his editor at House of Anansi and Shirley Gibson and others. And I think that's really interesting because that's where you're getting to see what they were saying versus how he was, what his own intentions and hopes were for the novel and what he thought was finished. Because you get the sense that he wanted to just produce and produce and produce as well. And so, I mean, just to get back to what Chris is giving us here, it's Harold Sonny Ladoo may have published these two novels for which he's so well known, but what we also get here is not just the fiction, the fragments and the short stories that you've drawn on, some of which have not been published anywhere else, which I thought was a huge contribution as well, because his short stories tell their own story, as you know, in addition to the books that we know. But what we also get here are letters between himself and his editors. We get ideas about the drafts that were in production, notes that he may have scribbled onto his drafts. We get a sense of the plans he had for books as well from those letters, in addition to the things such as the commentaries and the reviews. And so I think it's interesting, speaking as a scholar, scholars always are interested in sources. And so what you've given us here is room for us all to ponder these questions. You know, what was, how do we feel about yesterday's? Was it finished? Did his editor let him down? But more importantly, as a scholar, what you've given us is so much original material that we can go back to. And so on page 108, there's a series of letters back and forth between him and Dennis Lee and him and House of Anansi, all of which was previously unpublished. And so I think that's one of the important things that makes this the definitive biography as well. And on page, I think it's 129, you quote from Dennis Lee's poem. And one of the things in the poem that he writes is, but the books kept pouring through your system like heart attacks. 9 in 3 years, and the manuscripts rose in your bedroom, uneditable, for new ones came and sabotaged your life, and the life and the work wrenched farther apart. But what your book does is bring the life and the work together. And it's so interesting for us to see this panorama of materials put together for us to really think through some of these questions for the very first time.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a brilliant point there, which that you get the sense that there is a connection between Ladoo's almost kind of crazy kind of the 200 novels he's going to write in 10 minutes. But you also get from Christopher's book this sense that Ladoo knew he was doomed, that he knew he had very little time left, that he carried with him this thought that his end was fated. And I think that Christopher made that lies behind this kind of crazy attempt to produce in ways he could never sustain. I don't know if anyone else wants to. I think one of my duties was to throw this open to the floor. We've also seen the time we're out of time, but I remember in the very last session, Nicholas Laughlin came in and said, I can add another 5 minutes to this. So I'm going to pretend to be Nicholas and say, let's have another 5 minutes. I mean, there's nobody else coming in here. So are there any questions or comments that people would like to raise from the floor? If not, we'll go. Yes.
Thank you for this amazing conversation. I think one of the best Vocus has had. What I wanted to ask is, Jeremy, you brought up the question that he wrote and had aspirations like a man who felt like he had very little time, almost like he was doomed. And I was really interested because that's not something anybody can actually prove. But in writing, there seems to be so much kind of alchemy where people almost sometimes they write themselves into situations almost. So there's that kind of magical realism aspect of it. And I'm just wondering whether you're interested in pursuing that idea that he knew that he was going to die and he was going to maybe die violently.
In a sense that Ladoo knew that he was going to die violently.
Yes, well, it's all difficult to say. He certainly wrote about himself dying violently. As I said, the quote I said at the beginning, a man dying violently is equal to mystery. And he did write a story about being waylaid on his way home and being killed violently in the cane field, which is where he was found. So you could say that this was all something he anticipated, but you have to remember that story about him being killed in the cane field was written 3 years before he died. It was written and is in fact repeated in part in No Pain Like This Body. So it's not, is it something he felt? Maybe, but I'm not sure I could say he definitely thought he was going to die violently. But then again, before he left to Trinidad in 1973, he told everyone he was not going, he doubted he would come back because he would be killed. He's a very dramatic man, a real Trini. So, and he's a storyteller. He'd like nothing better. So I'm not sure I could say he was conscious of all that he knew he was going to die violently, but he felt it. As he said, he thinks his life is more violent than his novels.
There was a question there. Yeah.
Okay, Chris. From everything you've expressed, I realize, well, he seems to have been very conflicted. But through his work, he also seems to have been having some kind of higher self conversation with himself as he showed up in the world. And then that also seems to have contributed to the fact, to everybody with whom he came into contact having a different experience of who he was. Did you get, through his work, any insight into what his spiritual, if you will, grounding was that would have probably guided his way of living and his way of anticipating his life ahead?
Just clarify that.
Yes, so what, did you find any ways in which he had some means of guiding his spiritual life?
Yeah. I don't. Harold reportedly, he used to like to go to visiting Indian lecturers, Hindu lecturers. He would go to the pujas. He liked that. Whether he was religious or not, it does not come out in his writing as such. But he was Hindu. He went to a Hindu school. His father was Hindu. He initially went to a Presbyterian school because there was no Hindu school in in McBean at that time. But as soon as they built the school, he transferred within a year. So I can't say definitely I know he was a devout Hindu or whatever, but that's his upbringing. Hindu was his upbringing, and he was very interested in philosophy. He was interested in philosophy, and that would relate also to religious philosophy. There was one of the people who went to school, to university with him, like Mr. Khan, told me that he and this person used to go to a philosophy class, and they would sit for hours afterwards discussing the philosophical questions that came up in the class. So he was very interested in philosophy. But whether he was spiritual, I see no real evidence.
Nicholas hasn't stopped us, so I assume we could probably take another question.
You can take another question.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Could I?
Yes.
Yes. It's more like an observation, actually. In reading Monique Ruffy's introduction, there's a short statement that he would have given Naipaul a run for his money. Anybody recall that? In Monique Ruffy's introduction?
Right. Yeah, that Ladoo would have given Naipaul a run for his money if he continued writing. This is in Monique Ruffy's.
Thank you, Lennox. Lennox Sankar also was at university with Harold. So Lennox and Israel were student mates.
Yes, that's
at Erindale.
And his the name we gave him at university was Plato.
Yes.
In fact, I gave him that name.
He was called Plato because of his
philosophical
argumentative nature.
Exactly.
He would always take up the argument and
that's the point I'm coming to now, because we used to occupy the Caribbean table on the campus in the cafeteria. But Israel, myself, and a number of other West Indians, would sit there, spend hours there, talking all kind of foolishness, sometimes good things and so on. And one day we talking, and he said he's a better writer than Naipaul. He actually told us that. So I find that was insane. That was ridiculous. I mean, Naipaul is a famous writer, well known, so many books. You haven't even written a book yet. How could you compare yourself to Naipaul? And I told him that. I said, you crazy or what? How can you compare yourself with Naipaul? Well, boy, I got a good cuss out. And Israel here? No, he left? Israel was at the table also. And everybody froze because he really cussed bad. Everybody froze. Table went silent for about 2 or 3 minutes, and so on. Then suddenly, out of the blue, he said, well, he used to call me Churro because my parents had a restaurant in Vancouver called Churro's. He said, Churro, what about the Volkswagen, boy? I used to drive an old Volkswagen, and I used to carry Israel with me sometimes, and the wiper wasn't working, and when it's snowing, you had to go out and clear the snow on your windscreen. We call that Israel. So, out in the blue, Churro, after started cussing, whatever the Volkswagen boy, how it going? And that was the kind of character he is, the Naipaul thing. So when I saw the Naipaul statement in Monique Ruffy's introduction, I said, where did that come from? Because that was only our personal conversation. But I'd mentioned that to Christopher too.
Yeah, it can tell you that the Caribbean table features prominently in the book. It's very much part of the story. And I think we should perhaps end at this point, because we've been brought the closest to Harold Ladoo by those interventions. So thank you very much for being here and sharing with us your contact with Harold. And just before I shut up and Nicholas takes on, just to thank Christopher for giving us such a brilliant book. And to thank other panelists for asking such good questions and giving such good answers.
I was just sitting there in the audience and just kind of going with the flow and enjoying it, and I suddenly thought, oh wait, if the event is over, it means I have to come up and say something. So everyone, please, a very big round of applause for all of them. For Christopher, for the book, for Jeremy, Gabrielle, Kevin, for helping us get this book out into the world. I'm sure you're all, if you haven't bought the book already, you're all eager to know what's in it. If you'd like Christopher to sign the book for you, I'm sure he'd be willing to do that. This is actually the last event in the old fire station for this year's festival. Still have another event going on, so the festival is not over, but for this space, I think now is the time for me to say goodbye to everyone who's been in the old fire station for the last 3 days. It's been an action-packed festival, maybe too much action, but we are very happy that, 2023, we are back in person, all of us able to be here together, be with the writers, readers, writers, performers, speakers, everyone, actually be in a space together, celebrate books, celebrate writers. So I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to say that the last time I said this up here on stage, I jinxed myself. I said, see you next year, and that was in 2019. But we can't be so unlucky, right? It can't happen twice in a row. So see you next year at next year's festival. Thank you for coming, and please give yourselves a big round of applause for being here to celebrate this book. Thank you, everyone.